Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep, like way deep into 17th century philosophy. Think big thinkers, huge debates, and yeah, some seriously groundbreaking ideas. And right at the heart of it all is someone you might not expect, Lady Damaris Masham.
You're right. It's so easy to kind of gloss over figures like Masham when we think about this period, but that's a mistake.
Yeah, for sure.
We've got her biography from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. We've got excerpts from her published works. And we even have these amazing glimpses into her personal life through letters.
Ooh, juicy.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What we see is this picture of a woman who wasn't just content to sit on the sidelines of intellectual history. She shaped it.
So we're not just talking about some passive observer here.
Right.
This is a woman who's going toe-to-toe with some of the biggest names of her time, like John Locke, Leibniz. She's publishing books. She's engaging in these fierce philosophical debates and doing all of this at a time when women were largely excluded from, academia and intellectual circles.
It's pretty incredible. And her story begins in 1658 with her father, Ralph Cudworth. Now, he was a leading figure in the Cambridge Platonist movement. So imagine, right? Imagine growing up in a household where philosophical discourse is just the norm. Dad's library is this treasure trove of ideas just waiting to be explored.
Like a breeding ground for a future philosopher. But here's what gets me every time. Despite this, incredibly intellectually rich upbringing, she wasn't formally educated in the classics, like many of her male counterparts were. No Latin, no Greek, those traditional tools of philosophical scholarship.
Exactly. And you can kind of sense a little bit of frustration in her later writings, almost like she's making up for lost time. Well, if you won't teach me, I'll teach myself kind of thing.
Right.
And that's exactly what she did. She mastered Latin later in life using a method outlined in John Locke's Some Thoughts Concerning Education.
Wow. So she took Locke's educational philosophy as a personal challenge.
It's pretty cool, yeah.
I love that. But even before her deep dive into Locke, she was actively seeking out these stimulating intellectual environments. And London, in particular, seems to have been a real draw for her.
London was a hub of intellectual and social activity, and Masham thrived there. She was a frequent visitor to Elizabeth Stillingfleet's salon. Now, Elizabeth was a prominent figure, known for her wit and intelligence. Masham even used this playful nickname Urgunda for her in their correspondences.
I love those little glimpses into her personality and social life. It humanizes her.
Yeah.
It reminds us that these weren't just these abstract figures. They were real people with friendships and inside jokes.
Oh, absolutely. And it was actually within this vibrant social circle that she likely first met her future husband, Sir Francis Masham, who was related to Elizabeth. But perhaps even more significantly, it was also in London, sometime before 1682, that she crossed paths with the one and only John Locke.
Okay, now things are getting interesting.
Right.
This wasn't just a casual acquaintance. This was a deep, intellectual and, dare I say, emotional connection. They were exchanging letters filled with philosophical ideas. And get this, they even wrote love poems to each other.
Yeah, they did. Under the pseudonyms Philoclea and Philander, which just speaks to this level of intimacy and intellectual trust they shared. This wasn't just dry philosophical treatise, right? There was real passion and affection woven into their correspondence.
Makes you wonder how much of their, philosophical discussions kind of spilled over into those late-night chats, those moments of shared wonder and intellectual exploration.
Oh, I'm sure. Countless hours. And this connection only deepened when Locke actually became a long-term resident at her home, Oates, in Essex. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place within those walls, the back and forth, the challenges, the shared moments of insight.
Like a constant philosophical seminar, fueled by this mutual respect and admiration. But Masham wasn't content to just absorb Locke's ideas. She was developing her own unique philosophical voice. And that leads us to her decision to actually publish her own works.
And here's the thing. Both of her books, A Discourse Concerning the Love of God in 1696, and Occasional Thoughts in Reference to a Virtuous or Christian Life in 1705, both published anonymously. Now remember, this is a time when women were rarely recognized for their intellectual contributions, let alone celebrated.
It's unfortunate, but not surprising, given the social norms of the time. It makes you wonder how many other brilliant female minds were just, silenced or overshadowed simply because of their gender.
Absolutely. It's a question that really haunts intellectual history. But even without public acknowledgement, Masham's ideas managed to make a significant impact on the philosophical landscape of her time.
So, publishing anonymously, engaging in these debates with the biggest names of the era, and she can't even attend university lectures or participate formally in these academic circles, it makes her achievements even more impressive, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. It speaks volumes about her tenacity, her intellectual courage, and her unwavering commitment to engaging in these big questions of her day. And the topics she tackled weren't just abstract musings either, they were deeply relevant to the social and political climate of the 17th century. I mean, she delved into discussions on love, happiness, moral virtue, and even religious toleration.
Those themes still resonate today.
Hmm.
It makes you realize that despite the vast differences in our historical context, we're still grappling with many of the same fundamental questions about the human condition.
Exactly. And Masham's approach to these questions was both insightful and, at times, incredibly bold. Her first published work, A Discourse Concerning the Love of God, was actually a direct critique of John Norris, a prominent follower of Malebranche's occasionalism.
Okay, hold on a second, because I'm guessing some of our listeners might not be familiar with occasionalism. Could you give us a quick explainer?
Of course, occasionalism is it's a complex philosophical doctrine, but in essence, it proposes that God is the direct cause of everything that happens, including our emotions.
So, for example, when you feel happy, it's not because something in the world triggered that emotion. It's because God directly caused that feeling within you.
Wow, so it's like we have very little agency then. We're essentially puppets in God's grand cosmic play.
That's one way to interpret it. And Norris, being a devout follower of this doctrine, took it to mean that God should be the sole object of our love. After all, if God is the source of all our emotions, including love, then it follows that our love should be directed solely towards the divine.
So where did Macham stand on this? Did she buy into this idea of divinely implanted emotions and this exclusive focus on loving God?
Not at all. In fact, a discourse concerning the love of God is essentially a point-by-point rebuttal of Norris's occasionalist views.
Okay, so this is where we really start to see Masham's philosophical muscles flexing. She's not just passively accepting the dominant philosophical narrative of her time, she's actively challenging it.
Exactly. And her arguments against Norris's occasionalism are both insightful and, for her time, incredibly daring. All right, I'm on the edge of my seat. What were her main critiques of this idea that God is directly controlling every emotion, including our capacity to love?
So essentially, Masham argues that by making God the sole cause of our emotions, occasionalism diminishes the importance of the created world.
Why?
And by extension, like the significance of our relationships with other people.
So for Masham, it's not just about where our love is directed. It's about the very nature of love itself and how it plays out in our lives, right?
Hmm.
She's pushing back against this idea that our earthly experiences are somehow less important than our relationship with God.
Exactly. She argues that we come to love God through our engagement with the world, through observing the beauty and the order of creation, and through experiencing the joys and sorrows of human connection. It's not this top-down, divinely implanted emotion. It's something that grows organically out of our lived experience.
It's like if God created this amazing world and filled it with all these wonderful things, then it kind of follows that he would want us to experience it fully, to connect with it, to love it.
That's a great way to put it, and this is where we start to see the influence of Locke's epistemology on Mersham's thinking. You remember Locke's emphasis on sense and reflection as the sources of our knowledge? Well, Masham echoes this idea, arguing that our understanding of God and our capacity to love God stems from our sensory experiences and our reflections on those experiences.
Okay, I'm starting to see those connections. It's not about rejecting faith or denying God's role. It's about grounding our understanding of the divine in our concrete lived experiences.
Exactly. And this emphasis on experience and observation as these pathways to knowledge and even to loving God really sets the stage for Masham's later work, particularly occasional thoughts in reference to a virtuous or Christian life.
Okay, let's dive into occasional thoughts then. What are some of the key themes she explores in that work?
Well, like the title suggests, she really focuses on this idea of practical morality, on how we can live a virtuous life, in the here and now. And she does this by kind of navigating this tricky philosophical landscape.
Okay, tell me more about this landscape. What are some of the intellectual currents she's grappling with?
So imagine a spectrum, right, with two extremes. On one end, you have deism. This emphasizes reason alone as this foundation for morality and religious belief.
Okay.
On the other end, you have blind faith or superstition. This often rejects reason altogether in favor of, dogma and unquestioning adherence to religious authority.
Got it. So she's trying to find that middle ground between these two extremes, a space where reason and faith can coexist and inform each other.
Exactly. She calls it reasonable Christianity, and she's actually critical of both deism and blind faith, seeing both as kind of dangerous and ultimately leading to negative consequences.
So what does this reasonable Christianity look like in practice then? How does she propose we strike this balance between reason and faith?
For Mesham, it all comes down to education. She argues that education, particularly religious education, should be based on reason and critical thinking, and not on blind acceptance of doctrines or rote memorization of scriptures.
Okay, so she's not advocating for abandoning faith altogether, but rather for a more thoughtful and engaged approach to religious belief.
Precisely. She believes that through reason, we can arrive at this deeper, more meaningful understanding of religious teachings. And this, in turn, leads to a more virtuous life, one guided by ethical principles rather than blind obedience.
It's like she's saying that true faith isn't about shutting down your critical thinking skills. It's about using those skills to grapple with these complex theological concepts and arrive at a more nuanced and, personally meaningful understanding of your beliefs.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating here is how she connects this philosophical framework to the social and political realities of her time. Remember, she's writing in the wake of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, periods marked by intense religious and political upheaval.
That's a great point. So her arguments for religious toleration and a more reasoned approach to faith weren't just these abstract philosophical exercises. They were directly relevant to the challenges and conflicts of her day.
Absolutely. And she goes even further, arguing that irrational religion is not only intellectually unsound, but it's also morally detrimental.
Yeah.
She sees a direct link between blind faith and intolerance, fanaticism, and even violence.
It's like she's anticipating some of the arguments we're still having today about the dangers of extremism and the importance of promoting critical thinking and dialogue, across different belief systems.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the most radical and, from a modern perspective, most inspiring aspects of Masham's work.
I'm all ears. What's so groundbreaking about her approach to reasonable Christianity?
Well, she argues that education, this cornerstone of moral and religious development, shouldn't be limited to men. She makes a very passionate and compelling case for the education of women.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea for the 17th century.
Absolutely. Remember, this is a time when women were largely excluded from formal education, expected to focus primarily on, domestic duties and social graces and not intellectual pursuits. But Masham flips the script entirely.
So she's not just advocating for women's education as a matter of personal fulfillment or individual rights. She's arguing that it's essential for the moral and intellectual progress of society as a whole.
Exactly. She sees the denial of education to women as this grave injustice, not only to the individual women, but also to society at large. It's like, hey, we're missing out on all this potential, all these brilliant minds, simply because of these outdated social norms and prejudices.
It's incredible how she anticipates so many of the arguments that, feminists would later champion.
It really is. And her advocacy for women's education wasn't just theoretical. It was deeply personal. Remember, she had a son, Francis Cudworth Masham, and she was acutely aware of this, crucial role that mothers play in shaping their children's character.
That's such an important point. She's not just writing these abstract treatises. She's grappling with these ideas as a mother, as someone directly responsible for shaping the next generation.
And that personal dimension just adds this layer of urgency and passion to her work. She's not just arguing for some abstract principle. She's fighting for the future, for a world where her son and all children can benefit from, the wisdom and the insight of educated women.
Okay, so we've explored her upbringing, her deep connection with John Locke, her critique of occasionalism, her vision of reasonable Christianity, and her groundbreaking arguments for women's education. Is there anything else we should know about her philosophical journey?
Well, we can't forget her fascinating exchange of letters with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the most influential philosophers and mathematicians of the 17th century.
Whoa, Leibniz. That's a big name. What kind of philosophical sparring was going on between these two intellectual heavyweights?
Oh, they tackled some pretty complex and abstract philosophical concepts, including Leibniz's theory of pre-established harmony.
Okay, I'm going to need a quick explainer on that one.
Yeah.
Pre-established harmony. It sounds like something out of a mystical text.
It is a complex idea, but imagine the universe as this perfectly synchronized clock, where every gear, every spring, every movement is preordained by the clockmaker. That's essentially Leibniz's view of reality. God, the divine clockmaker, has created the universe in such a way that everything is perfectly synchronized, including our minds and bodies.
So it's like we're all just cogs in this grand cosmic machine, following a predetermined path set in motion by God.
That's one way to interpret it. And this raises some, thorny questions about free will and moral responsibility. If everything is predetermined, then are we truly responsible for our actions? Do we really have any choice in how we live our lives?
And I'm guessing these are precisely the kinds of questions that Masham raised in her correspondence with Leibniz.
You know it. She wasn't one to shy away from a good philosophical debate, even when it meant, challenging a figure as renowned as Leibniz. She questioned the implications of pre-established harmony for, human agency and moral responsibility, pushing back against this idea that we're simply passive players in this divinely orchestrated drama.
This is what I find so inspiring about Masham. She's constantly questioning, probing, challenging assumptions, even when those assumptions come from some of the greatest minds of her time.
And her willingness to engage in these debates, to participate in this intellectual back and forth, wasn't just a matter of, personal ambition. It reflected her active involvement in a larger network of intellectual exchange known as the Republic of Letters.
Republic of Letters. That sounds intriguing. What was that exactly?
Think of it as the 17th century internet for brainy folks. It was this international community of scholars, writers, and thinkers who corresponded with each other, shared ideas, debated theories, and contributed to the advancement of knowledge.
So Masham was part of this intellectual network, exchanging letters with big names all over Europe, not just Locke and Leibniz.
Exactly. And her participation in this network shows us that she wasn't just this, local talent, but part of a much bigger conversation, this vibrant intellectual ecosystem that transcended national boundaries.
It's amazing to think about how these thinkers were able to connect and exchange ideas across these vast distances, relying solely on handwritten letters and the occasional messenger. It speaks to their dedication to, intellectual pursuits and their yearning to engage with the most challenging questions of their day.
And Masham was right there in the thick of it, holding her own in these philosophical debates, contributing her unique perspective and challenging conventional thinking, wherever she found it.
This has been such a fascinating exploration so far. But before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear more about her lasting legacy. What can we, as 21st century thinkers, learn from this trailblazing woman philosopher?
That's a great question, and one that deserves careful consideration. Lady Damaris Masham's impact extends far beyond the confines of 17th century philosophy. Her ideas, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to reason and virtue continue to resonate with us even today. Yeah, it's really something when you start to look at it, because she wasn't just reacting to these big names like Locke or Leibniz. She was really forging her own path, blending these philosophical traditions in a way that feels, I don't know, it feels surprisingly modern.
Okay, yeah, break that down for me, because we've talked about Cambridge Platonism, Locke's empiricism. How did she, bring these together? They seem kind of different on the surface.
Think of it this way. Cambridge Platonism, with its focus on innate ideas, it's looking upward towards this transcendent realm. And then you've got Locke, and his emphasis on experience, he's grounded in the here and now, the observable world. What Masham does is she takes both perspectives and kind of weaves them into something new.
So not rejecting either side, but finding a way for them to coexist and to inform each other.
Exactly. It's like she's saying, hey, we can acknowledge the power of innate ideas, the sense of something bigger than ourselves, but we can also ground our understanding in what we experience, what we observe.
And we see this in her work on love, right?
Yeah.
She challenges that occasionalist view that love is just God pulling the strings. She's arguing that it's through, experiencing the world, connecting with others, that we come to love God.
Exactly. And that's a key part of her legacy, this idea that the material and the spiritual, they're not separate, they're intertwined. We don't love God in spite of the world, we love God through the world.
Makes her work feel so relevant even today, because we're often presented with this false dichotomy, faith versus reason, spirituality versus the material world. Masham's like, no, it's not an either or.
Right, and it all connects back to her emphasis on practical morality. It's not enough to just have the right beliefs. You got to live them out, embody them in your actions, your choices, how you treat others. It's about that link between thinking and doing, knowing and being.
Which brings us back to her, like, really fierce advocacy for women's education. It wasn't just about fairness. It was about making society better by tapping into this, like, intellectual power of women.
Absolutely. And that's a message that still resonates so powerfully today. How much are we still missing out on? How much potential is still being stifled because of these outdated assumptions about who gets to participate in intellectual life?
So if someone wanted to, like, understand Lady Damaris Masham's legacy in a nutshell, what would you say are the, like, key takeaways?
I'd point to three things. First, her ability to synthesize these seemingly opposing philosophical traditions. It shows us that complexity and nuance are often more fruitful than this rigid adherence to any one school of thought. Second, her unwavering commitment to reason and experience as pathways to both knowledge and virtue. And finally, her groundbreaking advocacy for women's education, not just as a matter of individual rights, but as this necessity for the moral and intellectual progress of society as a whole.
Those are powerful and timely lessons. It's incredible to think that a woman writing in the 17th century could offer insights that are so relevant to the challenges we face, even today.
I know, it's really amazing. Lady Damaris Masham's story is a testament to this enduring power ideas, the importance of challenging conventional thinking, and this vital role that women have always played in shaping intellectual history, even when their voices were silenced or marginalized.
So to all our listeners out there, if you're drawn to these big philosophical questions, if you're fascinated by this intersection of faith and reason, or if you're simply inspired by these trailblazing women who dared to think differently, Lady Damaris Masham is definitely worth getting to know.
Yeah, and as you kind of delve into her work, ask yourself, what resonates most strongly with you? What challenges does she pose to your own understanding of the world? What can we learn from her example about living a life of intellectual curiosity, moral courage, and this unwavering commitment to truth?
Keep those questions brewing, and we'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.